Dobar dan i dobrodošli u televizijsku emisiju globezoom NikolaKneza. Ovo je prva emisija sa kojom započinjemo rad i emitiranje serijala vijesti i važnih informacija. U našim emisijama nastojat ćemo prikazati i pojasniti samo bitne događaje. I to one koji podržavaju život, slobodu, istinu i domovinu. Većinom vremena izloženi smo medijskim lažima, očiglednim propustima i poluistinama koje nas usmjeravaju u krivom smjeru. Ovaj sam medijski servis pokrenuo za sve one koji žele znati istinu te graditi svijet sretnih i slobodnih ljudi. Današnju prvu emisiju posvetio sam Republici Hrvatskoj, svojoj domovini, nezavisnoj i slobodnoj Hrvatskoj državi, koja je nakon proglašenja svoje samostalnosti 1991. godine i kidanju svih političko-ekonomskih veza sa bivšom Jugoslavijom, bila napadnuta od strane Srbije i Crne Gore. Nakon 4-godišnjeg obrambenog rata, Hrvatska je vojska veličanstvenom vojnom operacijom Oluja porazila srpskog neprijatelja i okončala rat u Hrvatskoj, ali i u Bosni i Hercegovini. Ovaj puta govorit ćemo samo o jednom dijelu velikog hrvatskog nacionalnog postignuća održanja Hrvatske države. Vidjet ćemo prijelomne trenutke tih događaja kroz svjedočenje jednog od važnijih sudionika istih, a to je ambasador Sjedinjenih Američkih Država Peter Galbraith. Pozivam vas da pogledate ovaj intervju. Nadam se da ćete mnogo toga saznati, odnosno potvrditi ono što već znate ili ispraviti ono čemu su vas u najboljoj namjeri krivo učili. U svakom slučaju, ovo svjedočenje još je jedan bitan i važan dio informacije u učvršćenju naše hrvatske državne povijesnice. Čast mi je poželjeti dobrodošlicu poštovanom ambasadoru Peteru Galbraithu u naš program. Lijepo vas pozdravljam i hvala vam što ste pristali na ovaj intervju. Osobno mi je drago da smo sa vama otvorili rad, odnosno započeli sa emitiranjem prve televizijske emisije Knez televizije. Vjerujem da će razgovor sa vama biti izuzetno važan i zanimljiv, s obzirom da ste vi bili prvi ambasador Sjedinjenih Američkih Država u slobodnoj i demokratskoj Hrvatskoj državi. Vi ste u Hrvatsku došli 1993. godine. Lijepo vas molim, opišite nam svoje prve dojmove i kako ste u to vrijeme gledali na rat u Hrvatskoj.
I think it's important as we look back at the Croatian War, I would call it the Croatian War of Independence, 1991 to 1995, to see this as a war, first a war for independence, but as a war of self-defense. Croatia was attacked by the JNA, by the Yugoslav army, and the rebel Serbs who controlled 30% of Croatia's territory in the Krajina and in eastern Slavonia were supported, paid for, and put in position by what had become a foreign country, namely Serbia.
Opišite nam, molim vas, kako je američka administracija doživljavala srpske zločine u Hrvatskoj.
Enormous crimes were committed against Croats and in Croatia, notably the 87-day siege of Vukovar, the systematic destruction of the city, and then the murder of the patients at the Vukovar hospital, and they're being dumped in a mass grave in Optra. The ethnic cleansing of the Croats in the Krajina region, and many other, the shelling of Zagreb, which I witnessed, and took place, the shells landed close to my office. There were many crimes committed against Croatia.
Koja je bila pozadina ili bolje reći kakve su bile okolnosti na terenu koje su vodile prema izvođenju hrvatske vojne operacije Oluja?
Something that Tudjman had in mind, I think, from the beginning of 1995. And at the beginning of the year, he had announced that Croatia would not continue the mandate for the UN forces in the so-called UN protected areas. That is to say, sectors north and south, the Krajina region, sector west, western Slavonia, and then eastern Slavonia. And this generated a level of crisis. Ultimately, the United States and Vice President Al Gore played a key role in this, as of course did Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, negotiated a deal where the UN mandate would be renamed from UNPROFOR to UNCRO, UN in Croatia, and the mandate, instead of being from 6 months from March, what would that be, to October, it was basically 8 months to the end of November of '95. And I think that Tudjman's plan was that when winter came, that would be the time that Croatia would take military action to retake the Krajina if there hadn't been any progress in the peace negotiations. And the reason for that was that if you did it in November, the weather would still be quite good for an operation coming up from the coast into the Krajina region, but the weather would be quite bad and more difficult if you were trying to resupply the Serb forces in the Krajina from Serbia. And beyond that, Croatia didn't want to do anything that would, in the summer, which would upset the tourist season. Now, the tourist season was not so much, but it was beginning to recover after 1991. It is today and the most important source of revenue for Croatia, and even then it was important. So the idea was to do it later in the year, where there was both a military advantage and where it wouldn't have an economic impact.
Prethodno tome, dakle, 1994. godine, već je tekao mirovni proces. Možemo reći jedan od mnogih koji su bili uzaludni i od kojih su ljudi već postali umorni, jer nije donosio nikakvih rezultata. Kako je to izgledalo ovaj puta? Opišite nam što se sve događalo iza zatvorenih vrata.
The peace negotiations that related to the Krajina was a process that had been initiated by the Russians, Deputy Foreign Minister Vitaly Churkin, and it began with ceasefire negotiations in the Russian embassy in Zagreb. And after 2 sessions, we negotiated a ceasefire. I was included, along with the UN, and in negotiations, and I played a role in taking some of the proposals up to President Tudjman and getting him to agree to it. The second phase was conducted by David Owen, the former British Foreign Secretary, and the representative of the European Union, and Thorvald Stoltenberg, who was the United Nations representative. And this was meant to be economic and confidence-building measures, and it was going to be followed by a third stage, which was political negotiations that would involve the reintegration of the Krajina region into Croatia.
Kakva je bila sudbina tih pregovora?
Those didn't get off the ground, and this was largely because the Serbs were not serious about it. This then became a stumbling block to negotiations. Nothing was happened. And so by August of 1994, I felt that something needed to happen, and we couldn't just wait on the economic and confidence building measures. We needed to move to the political stage. And so in conjunction with Gert Ahrens, a German diplomat who represented the European Union, and who is David Owen's deputy, but not at all in agreement with David Owen, we worked up a plan that became known as the Zagreb 4 or Z4 plan, which basically provided for the integration of the Krajina into Croatia, but with very substantial autonomy. So the area would be demilitarized. Yes, the Croatian government would be at the border, but it would be able to have its own parliament. It would be able to use the Serbian language in the schools, and even to have its own banknotes, because they objected to the use of the kuna. They said, "Oh, this is the same as the fascist currency." So fine, you can have your own banknotes. You can call them dinars. Monetarily, they would be kuna, and there was some precedent for this. When I went down later to explain this to the Krajina Serbs, I brought them Scottish banknotes because although they're pounds, they're different because they're issued by the Bank of Scotland rather than the Bank of England.
Ambasadore Galbraith, nemojte mi zamjeriti, ali rekao bih da je to bila nevjerojatna ponuda prema srpskim pobunjenicima i teroristima sa vaše strane. Bili ste više nego velikodušni. Moram vas ipak pitati da li je to i u kojoj mjeri bila ozbiljna politička ponuda u datim okolnostima.
These were quite detailed proposals. They were never meant to be the settlement, but a basis of negotiation, and it was meant to illustrate to the Serbs just how much autonomy might be possible. We presented these plans to the two sides on the 29th of January. Tudjman didn't like it, but he agreed to negotiate on the basis of it. Reluctantly, but he understood that he didn't have to accept the plan. When we went down to Knin to present the plan to the leadership there, Milan Martic, the so-called president, Nikolic, the so-called prime minister, and Babic, the so-called foreign minister, Martic refused to accept it. It was we didn't ask him to agree to the plan. All we asked him to accept was the paper to look at it. It was as if we had placed something very disgusting on the desk next to him. He wouldn't. At one point, he said, "But how do you expect me to accept something I haven't read?" He said, "Well, here, read it." wouldn't accept it. And we spent 2 hours trying to persuade him. I arranged for a private session between the Russian ambassador and Martic so they could talk in Serbian, and the Russians were thought of as being more pro-Serbian. But here it was. Think of it. They're people from a region that has about 150,000 people. At this stage, it's been under sanctions for 4 years. It's isolated. One of the most impoverished places in Europe, and they're now being presented with a plan by the great powers of the world: the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations. And these guys, Martic, who was a policeman who had never finished high school, Nikolic had run a meat packing plant, Babic, the foreign minister, was a dentist. And now they're thinking that they won't even accept the plan. At the end of the 2-hour session, Nikolic said to us, he said, "You think you're professional diplomats, but you've made a huge mistake." And I looked at him and I said, "A huge mistake has been made, but we'll see who made it." So this was the end of effectively the end of the peace process.
kako ste i kada saznali za početak vojne operacije Oluja?
On July 21st, I went down to Brioni at the invitation of President Tudjman to join him for dinner with President Demirel of Turkey. And at the end of the dinner, Defense Minister Gojko Šušak pulled me aside to say that President Tudjman had decided on military action to through the Krajina to relieve the siege of Bihać.
Ambasadore Galbraith, vi ste bili prisutni u Splitu kad se potpisivala Splitska deklaracija između Hrvatske te Bosne i Hercegovine. Molim vas, recite nam pobliže svoje spoznaje o tome.
But on July 22nd, the day after Šušak had told me of Tudjman's decision for military action, I was asked if I would fly down to a summit that was taking place between Izetbegović and Tudjman, along with their top officials in Split. It was a very critical meeting. They worked out agreements on joint military actions in Bosnia. I was not involved in any of those negotiations directly, but I did talk to Miomir Žužul, who was at this point, I think, the Croatian ambassador to the United States, but a close advisor to Tudjman. And I had suggested to him that the joint declaration include the following language, that the Bosnia-Herzegovina requests the assistance of Croatia in the defense of Bosnia.
Zašto je taj dio teksta bio važan?
And why was that language important? Because it would justify, as a matter of international law, Croatia's direct military involvement in Bosnia. Because under international law, of course, you can't go into a territory of another state unless you're invited. And this was an invitation, and it was an invitation based on the inherent right of self-defense in the UN Charter. And so that was in the declaration. And then Žužul asked if I would be in the picture at the signing, standing behind. And indeed I was. I think it raised some eyebrows in Washington as to why I had done this. But for me, this was what was looming ahead, was the thing that could bring the war to Bosnia to an end and save Bihać. There were 160,000 people there, at least 40,000 of whom men and boys were at risk of being massacred.
Spomenuli ste kako je general UN-a, Britanac Ross, imao tajni dogovor sa Srbima da ih NATO neće granatirati bez obzira na njihova nedjela. U to vrijeme srpskim postrojbama u Bosni i Hercegovini zapovjedao je sad već osuđeni ratni zločinac Ratko Mladić. Kako je on iskoristio taj dogovor?
What Ratko Mladić decided to do was to seize the enclaves, the three in the west plus Bihać. He thought that would put the Bosnian Serbs in a much stronger position in negotiations. The operation began in July of '95, of course, with the attack on Srebrenica, which fell on July 13. The reason he felt he could attack Srebrenica is the UN had already signaled it was not, and with NATO's acquiescence, that it was not going to use air power.
Što mislite o tim zločinima i posebno o srpskom zločincu Ratku Mladiću?
Mladić, being Mladić, really a criminal, sadistic, cruel individual, wasn't just content with taking Srebrenica. Taking of Srebrenica shocked the West, but it didn't lead to any action, and then Mladić moved on to Žepa.
Ako mogu napomenuti, u isto vrijeme vrše se i napadi na UN zaštićenu zonu Bihać.
There was an attack on Bihać in July of 1995 with forces coming across the international border from Croatia, from the Krajina part of Croatia into Bihać, as well as forces from on the Bosnian side, Serb forces in Bihać. And this really is the context for why Operation Storm took place when it took place.
Možete li nam opisati kakvo je bilo stajalište vlade Sjedinjenih Američkih Država o hrvatskoj vojnoj operaciji Oluja?
And so I got a message, the message I wanted, which was to tell Tudjman that the United States effectively did not object. And I went down and I saw him in Brioni. My message was, said, we appreciate your willingness to spend treasure and blood to relieve the siege of Bihać. We want to warn you that if things don't go well, don't ask us to help you out. You're going to be on your own. And it included, as I had recommended, important warnings that you have to protect the civilian population, be concerned about human rights, and make sure you don't harm the UN personnel. Of course, Tudjman understood this very clearly, although I said this is not a green light, and he said, yes, I understand it's not a green light, but of course it was a green light, and I knew it, and people in Washington knew it.
Uzevši sve u obzir, koji su događaji prevagnuli da se operacija Oluja izvede prije jeseni kako je planirana?
But what really changed the situation on Operation Storm and why it took place in August was what happened in Bosnia. In the beginning of 1995, there was a ceasefire in Bosnia. It had been negotiated by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Like all the ceasefires in Bosnia, it wasn't really honored, particularly by the Serbian side, but there was some significant reduction in fighting. But by March, April, it really had broken down. And there was growing concern that the Serb plan was to divide Sarajevo, basically cut the inner city off from the airport. This led to NATO airstrikes, and the Serbs responded by taking UN peacekeepers as hostages, actually, chaining some of them to places where, to places that might be bombed. I mean, it was a total crime under international law. But the effect of that was to make the UN reluctant to authorize NATO airstrikes and NATO reluctant to undertake them. In fact, there was a secret deal between the UN general and the Serbs that there wouldn't be bombing. And the Serbs then took that as a green light to clean up the map of Bosnia and to take the safe areas.
Ambasadore Galbraith, da li možete malo pobliže i jasnije opisati proces donošenja te odluke? Na osnovu čega ste i zašto imali dvojbe odobriti oslobođenje Banja Luke, čime bi se uspješno okončao završetak rata, odnosno srpske agresije na Hrvatsku te Bosnu i Hercegovinu?
After Operation Storm, the military operations continued into Bosnia. And again, we had a period of somewhat confused U.S. policy making. Because initially, I got instructions to tell the Croatians to stop, not to continue. But the country that U.S. policymakers and the American public were most sympathetic to was Bosnia. It was those images from Sarajevo of women in high heels, running across streets, or in some cases being shot by snipers. That's really what engaged the American people. And the daily reporting out of Sarajevo by heroes like Christian Amanpour. And so to me it was absurd that you would stop a military offensive that now all the area that Croatia was most interested in had been recovered, and yet before the areas that were of interest to the Bosnians, particularly of the Bosniak or Bosnian Muslim population. So it wrote back and tried to protest my instructions.
Koji je bio odgovor vaše vlade?
I was told to go ahead. I did. Fortunately, the Croatians didn't really listen, and in some days, Holbrooke and I were able to get those instructions reversed. We met with Tudjman privately, and Holbrooke liked to meet with him, just the two of us, Holbrooke and myself. And we specifically told Tudjman that we wanted Croatia to take certain key areas that, and those included Kozarac, Prijedor, places I considered Prijedor to be something like the Auschwitz of Bosnia. Even though this was somewhat contrary to the official instructions, he and Shushak got the message, and it was also communicated privately. The issue came up a week later about Banja Luka. The Croatian forces were approaching Banja Luka, and Holbrooke arrived. He had instructions to tell Tudjman not to take Banja Luka.
Mnogi u Hrvatskoj misle da je predsjednik Tudjman napravio pogrešku jer vojnim putem nije oslobodio grad Banja Luku. Vidim da su instrukcije vaše vlade u mnogome pridonijele toj odluci. U ono vrijeme, dakle, 1995. godine, smatralo se kako bi upravo pad Banja Luke označio potpuni poraz srbijanske vojske i kraj njihove ideje o velikoj Srbiji. Zanima me da li je vaša administracija vidjela tu mogućnost. Što vi mislite o tome?
A defeat in Banja Luka would be a decisive defeat of a fascist Bosnian Serb regime that had engaged in genocide and mass murder. In short, there would be no Dayton, there would be no division of Bosnia, there would be the decisive defeat of the murderous and fascist side. And it was a difficult call. And in the end, because it was a difficult call, Holbrooke and I agreed that we would stay with the instructions we had, and so we went and told Tudjman not to go ahead, not to take Banja Luka. And for years later, and even to this day, I wonder whether that was the right decision.
Što vi mislite o hrvatskoj vojnoj operaciji Oluja?
Operation Storm was the turning point in the wars of the former Yugoslavia. Turning point both for the Croatia War, which had begun in 1991, and for the war in Bosnia. It represented a decisive defeat for the Serbian side in the conflict, the side that initiated it, and as a result, it led within a few months to the two peace agreements that ended the war, that is to say the Erdut Agreement, which ended the war in Croatia and brought about the peaceful reintegration of the last bit of Serb-held territory in eastern Slavonia, including Vukovar, and it led to the Dayton peace agreements, which ended the war in Bosnia.
Ambasadore Galbraith, jedno od velikih iznenađenja, ako tako mogu reći čak i misterija, dogodio se kad su vas ljudi vidjeli kako se vozite na traktoru sa srpskim civilima koji su po naputku srpskog političkog vrha masovno odlazili u kolonama prema Srbiji. Da li nam možete pojasniti taj neobičan potez sa vaše strane?
After Operation Storm began, of course, it went very quickly from a military point of view. I think on the third day, Petrinja fell, and the Croatians asked if I wanted to go down and see it. They weren't allowing other diplomats or even journalists to go to these places, but I did, and went down with, again, my girlfriend, Tuna, later my wife, and we went through Sisak and into Petrinja. It was really, it was quite a scene because the town was, there was relatively undamaged. There were a few signs of artillery. There was, but the population had left very suddenly. Laundry was still hanging. There was a bike and some flowers. I always wondered whether a child had been killed and the flowers left, or maybe they'd just been abandoned on the way out. The electricity was out. The ice cream shop with all the flavors written in Cyrillic. The ice cream was melting because there was no electricity, but it was still in the process of melting. I went over and saw the new Croatian authorities, and Croatia was very well organized. In all these municipalities, they had already had a municipal government ready to go in place, and so there I went to the municipal offices in Petrinja. There was the mayor, there was the new city council, and they were meeting. And then in the room below, there was bread, and the bread had been delivered that morning from the Serb bakery. But again, things were quite orderly. The troops were quite well behaved and disciplined. The next day, there had been trapped about 10,000 Serb population around Tapushko that wanted to leave. And a deal was arranged that they could pass from Petrinja through Petrinja to eastern Slavonia using the autoput, the highway, and as a way to get out. And when the first group left from Petrinja, passing through Sisak in an evening, they were attacked. And there happened to be a Reuters reporter there, and he wrote out a story, and he described the crowd and the population in Sisak throwing stones and garbage and manure. And the thing in the story that really upset me, he described some thug throwing a brick through the windscreen of a car, and there was the mother with her baby and having to pick shards of glass out of the baby's blanket. So I already had instructions to go see Tudjman about the importance of protecting the civilian population, including those who are fleeing. I read the story. The story also said that the police were watching all of this, smoking and doing nothing. And I said to President Tudjman, I said, in a normal democratic country, the Minister of Interior would have resigned or been fired when the police were doing nothing while civilians were being attacked. Well, Tudjman got very emotional. It was kind of a heated scene between the two of us. And I said, well, if you're not going to protect them, I'm going to go down and I'll ride with the convoy. You see what happens if the American ambassador is attacked.
I što ste onda poduzeli?
And of course, having said it, I had to do it. So my plan, I had an armored car. I thought, I can go in my armored car. If they throw stones, well, so be it. And I drove down to Sisak and then to Petrinya, and there was this long column of refugees. It was a very hot day. And I walked along. We had some water, which we handed out. Of course, I'd also brought all the press along because there's no point in doing a grand gesture if nobody knows. And in the course of going along the line, there was a very affable garbage man who was originally from Karlovac, but he is Serbian. He'd gone to the other side. He had a rather grumpy wife and a very pretty 9-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old. And he was, or a friend of his, he was driving a tractor, and the wife and the children were in a cart that was attached to the tractor. And he said, well, why don't you come with us? So I got on the tractor with him, and eventually the convoy pulled out. And when we went through Sisak, in fact, Tudjman had gotten the message. There were policemen stationed every 3 meters. The crowd, of course, was shouting insults, but nobody threw anything. And actually, when people saw me, oh, Galbraith, oh, Peter, they waved. And then they kind of wondered what I was doing with the refugee column. But I think it was a way to make a point, of course, to protect. I couldn't do this for every refugee column, but to protect these people. And the Croatian government got the message, and there were no further attacks on these refugees. And although it made me unpopular with some of the more nationalistic elements in Croatia, I think many Croatians came to realize I'd done Croatia a favor, because if there had been further attacks, it would have done much worse damage to Croatia's reputation. And in fact, it may have led to some of the people being responsible being indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia. So I think it was intended to be helpful to Croatia, and I think it was.
Bilo je podosta onih koji su kritizirali Dejtonski sporazum. Prije svega zbog činjenice da su Srbi kao agresori koji su počinili mnoge zločine u Hrvatskoj i Bosni i Hercegovini dobili na poklon pola teritorija te međunarodno priznate države. Kako je to moguće u vrijednosnom svijetu zapadne civilizacije i koja je bila osnovna namjera tog sporazuma?
For all the criticism I think that has been made of Dayton, it was never intended as a roadmap for the organization of a country. It was intended as a means of ending a war, and measured by that standard, it has been a success.
Vi ste bili pozvani u Haag, te ste nastupili kao svjedok optužbe, ali i kao svjedok obrane u kaznenom procesu protiv generala Gotovine, koji je, braneći časno svoju domovinu, završio na kaznenom sudu. To je jedini primjer u povijesti svijeta da se za obranu života i domovine pozivalo na suđenje. Recite nam malo više o tome i kako je izgledalo vaše svjedočenje.
Ante Gotovina, who was the commander of Operation Storm, was indicted by the International War Crimes Tribunal. And I was a witness in that case, as I had been in 3 other cases. But in the 3 other cases, Milosevic, Martic, and the Praljak-Perlic case, I had been a witness for the prosecution. in this case, I was a witness both for the prosecution and the defense, perhaps because the defense lawyer was shrewd enough to think I might have information that would be helpful to the defense, as indeed I did. One of the charges against Gotovina was for the shelling of Knin. And I had people into Knin just the day after the Croatian army took Knin. My people had free access, and we knew there was very little damage from the shelling. And I thought, and I testified, that I thought that the shelling was brief, that arguably there were military targets, and that in any event, it could in no way be compared to the 87 days of shelling of Dubrovnik, of Vukovar, that made it look like Berlin in 1945, the shelling of Dubrovnik, a place that had no military significance, or the 1,200 days of shelling of Sarajevo. This was 36 hours, and the damage was not great. The other point is that after Operation Storm, Gotovina wasn't there anymore. He had continued with the Croatian military into Bosnia with Operation Mistral. And so I testified to this in his trial, and I think perhaps it was helpful to his ultimate acquittal.
U vašem ste mandatu američkog ambasadora u Hrvatskoj najviše komunicirali sa predsjednikom Franjom Tuđmanom. Možete li za naše gledalce upisati kakav je on ostavio dojam na vas kao državnik i kao čovjek?
Franjo Tuđman was a very interesting figure to me. First, it has to be said, Americans, the U.S. government official, in fact, most Americans didn't like him. They thought of him as having an authoritarian character, and they looked at as being anti-Semitic, looking at some comments he made, and even being something of a fascist. I saw him differently. First, I was aware of his history. Of course, he'd been a partisan, but in the Second World War. But I actually thought he was a good leader. Not that I agreed that everything he did, but that he had good leadership qualities. That he was able to attract high-quality people, both on his economic team and his national security team. He was able to delegate to them, allow them to work, or in the case of the national security team, negotiate on his behalf, and yet he was the person always in command. But he would listen. He would listen to the people on his team, and they could get him to do something. And so I think that was an important quality. I think the character that Americans associated with being authoritarian or even somewhat potentially fascist really had to do with the fact that he had a 19th century view of the world, very outmoded for the last decade of the 20th century. He believed, he saw great power politics of the kind that took place before the First World War every place. He imagined that the United States saw this part of the world as being strategically important because we'd want to have every bit of territory on our side that we could, and that we were, interested in countering Serbia because it was Orthodox and therefore linked to Russia. It was a misunderstanding of how we saw the conflict. He believed that there was a conflict of civilization, that Croatia was on the western side because it was the eastern edge of the Catholic Western world, in competition to the Serbia, which was the western edge of the Eastern Orthodox world. And then there was the spear of Islam coming up from Bosnia. Again, that was not how Americans saw this conflict. They saw it in terms of an assault by Serbia and to some degree by the Croatia, the Bosnian Croats, on the independent sovereign state of Bosnia. They didn't see, and we didn't see the Muslims as as representing Islam or a threat. We saw them as representing Western values. Particularly the women in high heels trying to go to work in Sarajevo and being, running to escape snipers. The man playing classical music at the site of a massacre. I mean, we thought of the people who we most thought were like us were in fact the Muslim population in Sarajevo, not the nationalists in Serbia and not the nationalists in Croatia. But Tudjman never understood that. But again, he had a strategic vision. He stayed with it, and ultimately he was successful. He both understood military issues, and he had an understanding of that war was not easy. There were plenty of people who were playing the game of war, but that wasn't Tudjman. He understood it.
Koga biste još izdvojili iz tog vremena od ljudi koji su igrali ključnu ulogu u oblikovanju obrane Republike Hrvatske i borbe za njenu nezavisnost i suverenost?
And the other key figure in this period was Gojko Šušak. He spoke our language. I don't mean just that he spoke fluent English, which he did, of course, because he had spent much of his adult life in Canada and had been a businessman. Gojko understood the way North Americans think. He was not going to be caught up on a symbolic issue. Tudjman would, some of the others would, but for Šušak it was really the substance. And so he was the person, if you wanted to get something done and he agreed to do it, it would be done.
Bili ste svega nekoliko puta u društvu sa ratnim zločincem, predsjednikom Srbije Slobodanom Miloševićem. Što mislite o njemu?
Milosevic, who through much of this conflict was thought of as the brilliant one, whereas Tudjman was not. And Milosevic was very tactical. He had no strategic vision. He had no ability to delegate. He handled everything. He had no discipline. And this was a man who, in a negotiating session with the American Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, at Dayton, which I attended, the meeting was set for 4 o'clock. He shows up at 4:35, drunk, and proceeds to drink a bottle and a half of red wine. And again, on a negotiation about the future of his country. And whatever tactical brilliance he had, it kept reducing the size of Serbia and making Serbia's situation more difficult.
Ambasadore Galbraith, hvala vam na vašem iskrenom uvidu u pojedine povijesne događaje i predanoj službi u Hrvatskoj od 1993. do 1998. godine. Vjerujem da ste u velikoj mjeri razjasnili pitanja koja su bila nedorečena. Vi ste izgradili prvi most povjerenja i odlične suradnje između Hrvatske i Sjedinjenih Američkih Država. Svojim ste radom bez sumnje postali nedjeljivi dio naše povijesti. Hvala vam još jedanput na svemu dobrom što ste učinili za hrvatski narod. Nadam se da ćemo u skoroj budućnosti imati prilike razmijeniti vaša znanja o sadašnjem stanju na istom prostoru. Dragi gledalci, posjetite web stranicu Hrvatskog filmskog instituta na kojoj možete vidjeti par odličnih filmova, pročitati osvrte autora, odnosno i akademske radove relevantne po temama za našu hrvatsku povijest, kulturu i naciju. Ujedno, želja nam je komunicirati Hrvate cijelog svijeta, te vas stoga molim da se javite sa svih kontinenata svojim vijestima i idejama za koje mislite da će beneficirati i oplemeniti našu kulturu, ekonomske i nacionalne odnose. Lijepo vas pozdravljam, želim svaki uspjeh i svako dobro. Sljedeći intervju bit će sa grofom Nikolajem Tolstojem. Srdačan pozdrav i vidimo se uskoro.